important things will be resolution, pixel density, refresh rate, what connections you have, and then we'll talk a little bit about smart TVs. We'll talk about computers. We'll go into laptops versus desktops, monitors for those, components you might want for them, and then discuss kind of the usage and determining what you might look for in a computer depending on what your needs are. Then we'll also cover cell phones a little bit, kind of the importance of, the individual components such as screen, battery, what type of radios are in them, whether you go with a contract or an unlocked phone, and then we'll discuss kind of those Black Friday things. I'm not going to really give you any specific deals that are out there, but give you kind of a price range of what you should expect for items, and we'll answer any questions you have after that. So, starting in with TVs and monitors, key terms that we're going to talk about will be resolution, pixel density, display type, refresh rate, and HDMI. Probably heard some of these terms maybe before, most often maybe resolution, HDMI. And then we'll kind of confront some buzzwords, HDR, real/clear motion, and then like Dolby Vision, sound, other things that they might throw at you as marketing speak, which could be little perks to what you're buying, but we want to cut through to kind of the most important things you want to look for. The resolution of any TV or monitor is measured in pixels. So those are the tiny individual dots that make up an entire image. So I've given this little kind of illustration here that talks about the various resolutions that you might find. Within the upper right-hand corner, having like your old television standard definition. So that was 640 pixels by 480. That's width by height. So as you can see, we're starting to get these higher and higher resolutions, and going up to 4K being kind of one of the more common ones that you're finding in televisions at this point in time. So if you're out there buying, you're going to see probably 1080p and 4K. So 1080p is this 1920 by 1080 resolution you have here in this little purple box. And as you can see, if you compare this to your 4K, you're looking at about 4 times the size. So that's kind of where that 4K comes from. So 1920 times 2, 3840, 1080 times 2, 2160. So it's 4 times the resolution. If you're looking for a computer monitor, you're normally looking at 1080p and 4K, but there's also this nice little kind of sweet spot in there, which is 1440p, which kind of exists between those. So you have, this number of pixels, and you're saying, okay, well, I have a 4K TV. What size do I want? You can go anywhere between a 24-inch 4K monitor, 27-inch 4K monitor, to a 100-inch 4K TV. The number of pixels remains the same depending on, regardless of the size you get. I mean, 4K is 4K, so it's going to be 3840 by 2160. But when you go up to a 100-inch screen, obviously those pixels are going to be bigger. So that's when we start talking a little bit about pixel density and how many pixels are in a space. So, when you go to a larger screen, the pixels are going to be bigger. When you go to a smaller screen, they're going to be smaller. So if you ever hear the term pixel density, that's talking about how many you're packing into a space.
So Devin, let's pause for a quick question here. So Jason wants to know, is the P important in 180p? Is there a 4K-P? And does P stand for pixel there?
So there's I. You might have seen maybe a 480i, 720i, 1080i. That means interlaced. So that's effectively like half. Then the P is for progressive, like progressive scan. So that's a full scan of all the pixels. I'm not sure how else to break that down. In most cases anymore, you're going to have them all as a P for progressive. I can't really remember the last time I saw something that was sold exclusively as a 1080i or 720i option. So in 4K, yeah, you're not really going to see that delineation.
So Jason's asking the advanced questions here, in other words.
Yeah, Jason, you're asking the good ones here.
Okay, let me ask the very not advanced question. So when I walk into a store, what am I really encountering? Like what category do most of the TVs you find in stores nowadays fall into?
So you're going to find, if you are browsing through your ads, or you're browsing through Black Friday deals, or you're walking into a store, you're almost always going to find 1080p and 4K televisions. And they're always going to come in varying sizes. So anywhere from, a 27-inch all the way up to, like I said, 100-inch, primarily in that sweet spot of like 42 inches to 65 inches is kind of where, the biggest market is, at least from a TV perspective. So 1080p generally costing less because it's a lower resolution display. 4K typically costing a little bit more because it's a higher resolution display. What would guide you in terms of which one you might want to choose depends on how far you're sitting back from the TV. Like, there's no point in getting a 4K display and sitting like 2 feet away from it. You're not really going to get the benefit of that. So you want to kind of consider those things. But if the source material you're feeding into it, say you have a streaming service like Netflix, they have a plan that allows you to play 4K content. So if you have a plan that does 4K, it might be nice to be able to have a display that would play it properly. If your source or your video is only 1080p resolution, it doesn't usually make sense to have the 4K if that's all you're doing. So you can save a little bit of money there. Now, I said that the 4K is 4 times the 1080p. If you play a 1080p video on a 4K display, it's going to look just like a 1080p video. So it's not going to matter there. So if you have the money to spend, you might want to consider going up to the 4K. But 1080p would be a fine option.
Okay, so that plays into the next question I want to ask you. So if you were to walk into the store, what would you pick as far as resolution goes if you wanted to kind of get the most bang for your buck? And what would you pick if money was not an object at all? Just what's the highest, best possible thing?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about different display types. But if I was going bang for my buck and I was buying a new television, and I had anywhere between about $300 to $600 to spend, you can get a pretty good 4K television for that price. If I'm looking for the lowest possible cost, 1080p is probably going to be your best option. Now, with some of those Black Friday deals, the 4K numbers come down and make it really competitive with a 1080p option. So for bang for my buck, 4K. Any other questions?
Not yet, but everybody feel free to type.
Yeah, please keep asking. So when I kind of qualified that bang for the buck and what would I be going for and dancing around that, like if money was no object, this is where, we're going to come into that money is no object thing. So there's 2 main display types that you're going to find when you go shopping for a TV. You're going to have LCD, which is liquid crystal display, and you're going to have OLED. So a liquid crystal display is going to be just that, like like you have on your calculator. That's a liquid crystal display. So that has a kind of a sheet where it actually kind of fills in what the pixels should be doing or what image is on it. And then it's going to have a backlit panel that's going to kind of shine the light through that. And that's how you get your image, your bright image. That is the current most cost-effective option. The only downside you have with that is you could have some issues with light bleed. And when I say that, it's light coming around the border of the panel. You can have some issues with that on lower price, lower quality televisions. and then the contrast that you would get on that, and when I say contrast, I mean the difference between your darkest color and your lightest. So like a black and a white. The difference between those two is going to end up being your contrast. So you don't get as dark a blacks and you don't get as bright a whites if you're using an LCD panel. For most people, that's not going to matter. It's totally fine. Myself, we have an LCD TV pretty much for all of ours. And it's not that big of a deal. Unless you're a huge video file, it's perfectly fine. The OLED ones are kind of a newer-ish technology. They have just essentially a ton of little diodes. They're electrical devices, and what they do is they send electricity to these individual diodes, and those make up the individual pixels of the image. Now, that gets rid of these light bleed issues you have by having a backlit panel, but you're paying for it. So it ends up being a lot more expensive, but it looks a lot better. So if I had a money was no object thing, I would probably go with an OLED TV. So
and that's also the newest technology you said?
Yeah, that's the newest emerging. It's been around for a few years, but it's only come into the consumer market as affordable within the last couple.
Okay, this is another one of my questions, and I'm not sure if it exactly has to do with LCD and OLED, but what type of TV causes shows to have that kind of soap opera effect, if people know what
I'm going to talk about that. That's a great question. So we're going to get into refresh rate in a little bit here.
Okay.
Was that your question?
That was I'm throwing questions at you too.
Oh, that's a good question. Okay. So the other thing that you might want to consider when you're buying a TV, and this is getting into some of the advanced stuff, is the connections that you're going to have on it. So as a relative standard for a television, you're going to have HDMI. So HDMI is high definition multimedia interface. It is video and audio and sometimes network through one cable. So if you bought a TV within the last few years, you'll have that kind of funny flat shaped connector that you're going to connect between your Blu-ray player, your DVD player, your Roku, Amazon device, and the back, and that's all you have to do. It just feeds, the video and audio through it. And there are multiple different versions of HDMI that have come out, and their capability as far as like what resolution they'll do, what refresh rate, which we'll talk about, what they'll do. The only thing, you don't need to memorize this. Please don't memorize this image. The only thing you need to know is a higher number for HDMI is better, with your sweet spot kind of being in the 2.0 range. And pretty much any newer TV is going to be an HDMI 2.0 or above device. You might also want to consider if you have any analog sources. So component video or RCA, your red, your white, and your yellow wires for the RCA. Because a lot of TVs aren't coming with those anymore. So if you're using like an old video game console or you're hooking up a VCR, you might want to look specifically for something that has those connections. Otherwise, you have to get an adapter that would take it from the analog signal, your RCA connection, to a digital signal like HDMI. They are out there, but it would be an additional cost or an additional item you'd have to add in. Okay, so let's talk about this soap opera effect a little bit here. So that has to do with the refresh rate. So refresh rate is how often the image is updated on the display, whether that's a television or a monitor. And that is from the first pixel in the upper left-hand, I think it's right on the image here, in the upper left-hand corner, all the way across and down to the lower right-hand corner. So every pixel on the screen is essentially changed over to the next in the image. So that's how often it's done. The standard refresh rate for years in North America has been 60 hertz. So once every 60th of a second, or 60 times a second, you are refreshing those pixels and changing the image. based on the video source or image. 60 hertz would be the standard, and most TVs are that. 60 plus hertz, so you can get a higher refresh rate display, would be what we would call high refresh rate. Higher refresh rate generally equates to a cleaner picture, and this has everything to do with how your brain interprets motion. So what will happen is, if you think about your TV screen and it's refreshing every 60th of a second, your brain is trying to interpolate what the next movement is going to be between those frames. So I'm here, and the next frame I'm here, right? So there's this time and this distance between where my hand is. And what your brain tries to do is, if it can tell that you're moving this way, it wants to continue transposing that movement along. So what will happen is, every 60th of a second, you get an update that shows, and your brain fills in the middle. So when you see something at 60 hertz, the blur that you might see, so if there's fast action going on and stuff is moving really fast, is your brain kind of filling those in. When you get a higher refresh rate, you have more frames, so there's less time for your brain to kind of interpolate that motion into a continuous movement. So if you get something, you might see them advertised with 120 hertz or 240 hertz. That has to do with how quickly it is refreshing the motion on the screen. Do we have a question?
We do. It's about
I can sense it. Okay,
so
go ahead.
We're gonna go back to that question in a second, but I did want to ask, so if you know you're a person who knows what we're talking about with that funny soap opera effect, and you really want to avoid it, but you're purchasing a new TV, how do you avoid it?
So let's talk about why that happens quick. So I talked about interpolating that motion, right? Your brain's trying to fill in the gaps between the refresh on the display. Most of your source material, movies, for instance, are shot at 24 frames a second. So if you're updating 60 times a second and your source is only 24 times a second, you might have some bleed over between frames. Or your TV, like sports, tend to be at 60 frames a second. So every time there's a frame update, you will have a new picture. What happens is, when you pair a lower, frame per second source with a higher refresh rate, it mucks with it. Specifically, if they're doing something called interpolated motion is kind of the technical term for it, but companies will call it true motion or clear motion or something like that. And what that display is doing is, it's taking that lower frame rate source material, and it's doing what your brain naturally would have done, which is to take this frame and this frame, the frame after it, and try and figure out what happens in between. And so it's injecting these kind of fake frames into it. And then that's why it looks very smooth, but not quite natural, because your brain is trying to already do that. And when it doesn't match what it sees on the screen, it looks like a little artificial or flat. So companies will sell you on this true motion or clear motion or something like that. And I can't tell you anyone that enjoys it.
So that's the phrase you want to avoid?
Yeah, so if you say soap opera effect to somebody, say, I don't want a soap opera effect, they're gonna know what you're talking about, because it's such a common phrase. Or if you describe it as, it just looks kind of weird, like it's too fast and everything looks like a soap opera, that they'll know what you're talking about. But the good thing is
the term.
Go ahead.
True motion is the actual term?
Well, it depends on the company. They'll have a different marketing phrase depending on what it is. True motion, clear motion, or sometimes they'll call it effective refresh rate. It's not really a true refresh rate. It's what they're doing to interpolate that motion. The good news is, in a lot of cases, you can turn that off, but you have to dig through your menus to do it, and it can be per source, and it's kind of a pain.
So we're going to give everyone your phone number, so when they run it.
Yeah. You can have my phone number, and I will tell you how to turn it off because it's awful.
Okay, now I do want to ask a question from the crowd. Now, you might need to go back to your previous slide. Logan would like to know what input or output matters for the 2.0 HDMI. Does my 144 hertz monitor have to have a 2.1 to run at 144 FPS, or does just my GPU?
So I'm running a 165 hertz 1440p display. And I am using a DisplayPort 1.2b, I believe. So I don't have that chart here. In most cases, you're going to be using a DisplayPort output. Your GPU might have an HDMI that supports it, but a lot of displays might not on the HDMI input. They both have to support that standard. So if you look at this little chart here, and your HDMI version on your card is, HDMI 2.0, not 2.1, you're not going to be doing 240 hertz through HDMI, in which case you might want to consider going to DisplayPort instead. So both of the items have to support it. The GPU has to, and the display has to as well. They both have to fit the standard. I hope that answers that question.
Okay, good question. Type again if you have a follow-up.
Yeah. And good on you for doing high refresh rate. It looks way better anyway.
Okay, he said that answered his question. So
awesome. Okay, so I mentioned, the buzzwords real and clear motion. It's not real refresh rate. It makes everything look like a soap opera. It's artificial. It's flat. If you walked in and you saw maybe your favorite movie with that motion, you'd probably ask what was wrong. It's all marketing speak. They try and upsell you as that is a feature. You can promptly ignore it. HDR is a new one that you might see out there. It's kind of finally come into prominence, but it means high dynamic range. And that is the range, I kind of talked about contrast. That is the range between your blackest black and your whitest white. And how they shoot it is by capturing that entire range. They might take 4 samples at different exposures and combine them into one. So you have, a very, very dark darks and very light lights, and everything is very, very separated. HDR content is not really out there. There are a lot of games that support them. I know that the newest consoles support HDR, and a lot of games do. From a movie perspective, or other sources, some streaming services have HDR content. Netflix does. If you have a choice and there's not like a huge price difference, choose HDR. There's no downside to it. You're probably not going to see this on your lower end panels, so it might be a moot point, but kind of in that mid-range average priced panel, if you have a choice, get the HDR. Dolby Vision, other kind of buzzwords. Dolby Vision is essentially their version of HDR. It's typically not worth the cost. Like if you're talking $200 difference just to get, the tag Dolby Vision on it, it's probably not worth it. So consider that. The more words they attach to it, the more expensive it gets. And if you can't figure out what those words are, they're probably not important. Just pro tip there. Any questions anymore?
None in the chat at the moment.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on and keep going with computers.
Okay, hold on. I really like Jason. He just entered a question. I really like his question because it really takes it down to the simplest level.
Please do.
Just for a minute. Why are some 55-inch TVs 200 and some 800?
Okay. Good question. Sometimes it comes down to brand name. Like if you're buying a Sony, like a Sony Bravia over like a TCL, you know that the Sony is probably going to be the more expensive option just because it's brand name. Now, with that brand name, they might be using a higher quality panel. There might be some better software built into it for image processing. A lot of times we'll have some sort of signal processing to make it look better or whatever. They might be using OLED technology, a number of different options there. For the lower end TVs, I say lower end, the kind of unknown brands, your TCL, which is kind of come into prominence, and a few other things, they are not making their own displays. Displays only come from like a few different countries in Asia, and there are a lot of manufacturers that use the same display. So on those lower end ones, they're just buying a display, putting their own, software behind it or their own kind of wrapping around it and selling it as their brand. Samsung and other companies actually have their own display manufacturing facilities. So they're in control of kind of the quality of it and are investing into R&D for it and then wrapping their own stuff around it. So they tend to be a little bit nicer because they're not kind of a lowest common denominator thing, and it's tailored for their product line. Does that answer that question?
It seems to, yeah.
Okay. You also might have like a smart TV capability with one that you might not have with another. Like for instance, you might have Roku on one. You might have, like a Amazon, Fire built into it. There's a number of different things that can affect the price. Yeah. Good question. Any other ones?
No, keep going.
Okay. Key terms for computers, and I know I have a couple probably deeper dive people on the line here. I'm going to keep this kind of a little bit higher, but please, submit your questions if you want me to go a little bit deeper on these things. But when you're buying a computer, there are a number of considerations that you have, but your primary ones are going to be CPU, RAM, and hard drive. Other considerations you're going to want that we're going to talk about are, laptop versus desktop. What sort of components do you need with that computer? Monitors. So you can go back to what we talked about before. That'll totally apply to this right here. More power, more better? Sometimes. Depends on how you're using it. So we'll kind of discuss that a little bit. And then we'll talk a little bit about operating systems. So what is a CPU? It's a central processing unit. That is the brains of your computer. That takes all the inputs and all the outputs and kind of connects them together. So all the instructions that you have that are coming in, like clicking your mouse and having something happen on the screen, pass through your CPU. Key terms that you would probably run into if you're shopping for a computer and looking at CPUs would be cores, threads, and frequency. Cores and threads kind of being the important part of that there. Core, you can think of a core as an employee at a work site. So the more employees you have, the more you can do, right? And the threads would be their efficiency, so how quickly they're able to do the job. The more threads you have for those cores, typically the more you can do, which means the computer is more powerful, or CPU is more powerful. And then frequency, it is important, not as important for just daily usage and stuff, but in like gaming circles and people who are like doing high-end machines, they might overclock their machine to get some more frequency out of it. And that's how often it executes these instructions. Typically speaking, more of any of those items is better. So more cores, more threads, or better. Is there just Intel? So everyone knows that, you've seen the commercials for years. Intel is one of the biggest players in the market, but there is another player that rivals them pretty well, and that's AMD. So you might see an AMD sticker on a device. That means that they are providing the CPU for that machine. So the two big players, Intel and AMD. Intel used to be kind of the de facto, what you went to, what you looked for, what you bought. AMD has been putting out a lot of really good products, so don't really shy away from them. And in fact, in a lot of cases, they can be a lot more cost effective. So some of the kind of indicators you'll see when you're shopping for a computer, from an Intel side, you might see i3, i5, or i7. As you go up from i3 to i5 and i7, you add more cores, more threads, and you typically have a higher frequency clock on it. Same with Ryzen. So that's AMD's line right now, AMD Ryzen processors, and you'll have 3, 5, and 7 for those as well. It's the same thing. Cores, threads, frequency. So higher as you go up the chain. So if you want a more powerful computer, that's a good rule of thumb, is the higher the number, the better.
So who's like the person that can get away with buying the lowest level of that? Like the person who just turns on a computer and only has Microsoft Word and maybe Facebook. Can they, that person, do the lowest level?
Then you're probably totally good in an i3 or a Ryzen 3. You probably don't need much more than that.
So who's the person who needs the highest level?
So if you're on your highest level, either you are like a gaming enthusiast or you are a content creator. Like for instance, if you're doing any streaming, having a more powerful CPU helps with that because of the encoding for the video. And if you're maybe doing editing, video editing, photo editing, those packages are very CPU intensive. So having a higher level processor is going to make it faster for you to do those actions. So say you have like a long video you're making and you're doing this for work or you're doing it often for just hobbies. Having a higher number drastically cuts down on the amount of time it takes to, say, encode that video. So professionals and enthusiasts would probably want the 7.
So most of what we're talking about here is speed that the computer does things.
Speed and power. Yep.
Okay, so the lowest end computer could theoretically do those things, but it would just be a nightmare because it'd be so slow.
It has to do with efficiency in executing actions, like how quickly it can do them and how many it can do. So higher up you go, the more it can do. I will say, even though I am a gaming enthusiast and have built my own computers, I've never found a reason to go above a 5. And in fact, it's a lot more cost effective to do that than going with a 7. I mean, we're talking like hundreds of dollars cheaper to go with like a 5, because a lot of what I'm doing, for instance, gaming, is not terribly CPU intensive. It's mostly GPU intensive. So video cards, which are the actual things that generate the images. So we can talk about that later. But so like I said, even somebody like myself who's really into it typically never go above a 5. So don't let a 7 make you think that you have to get it just because it's more powerful. You can usually get away with a 5.
What if you're just an incredibly impatient person and you need your computer to go?
Sure. If money is no object and you're super impatient, get a 7. That's fine. Now I'm ignoring the nuances of there are different models within these families. I'm just going with the rule of thumb that the higher number is typically going to be more powerful. So don't hold me to, I bought a 7 and it's not as good as this 5, because that can happen. But generally, unless you're an enthusiast, you won't know the difference. RAM. So another component that's incredibly important to your computer is going to be RAM, or random access memory. And this is super fast, efficient storage for ongoing tasks or things that are happening within your computer. So when you open your browser, you open up Chrome, it kind of is loading into your RAM so it can retrieve that stuff quickly. It's a lot faster than your hard drive would be. And that's specifically why we use this, because when we close down Chrome, we don't really want to save it to our hard drive, everything we did. We want to run it. We want all the stuff to efficiently store in there, and then we want it cleared out when we're done. That's what RAM does. Generally speaking, more is better. Recommendation would be, for me, 8 gigabytes minimum. So if you walk into a store and you're looking at a computer and it's got Windows 10 on it, I would say 8 gigs is kind of the minimum. And most are selling at that point. If you see 4, it gets a little wonky, and you might notice that things are taking a while to execute. Additional considerations: frequency. You might see it listed as like 1600 megahertz or 3200 megahertz. Generally speaking, higher frequency is better. And then also there's timing. So I put these example numbers here, 7, 8, 8, and 24. You don't need to know exactly what those correspond to, but the lower the number on there, the better it is, because that's the amount of time it takes to execute these instructions and to access the memory of the RAM. So if you're going in consumer level and you're buying a computer, generally speaking, more RAM is better. Hard drive. This is storage. So a lot of times people confuse the term memory and storage, non-volatile memory, which your hard drive is. If you say memory to me, I'm going to assume you're probably talking RAM. So if you've ever seen somebody confused, when you've used it that way, that might be why. So HDD or hard drive and RAM, storage, memory. And what your hard drive is doing is it is doing non-random storage of files and data. So you are specifically putting files in a location. You don't do that with RAM. The system does that for you. And that's the only thing that's accessing the RAM. You're storing, Word documents, PowerPoint slides, games, videos, that sort of thing in a location like the C drive, D drive. You have 2 main styles of hard drive. There's some hybrids, but there's two main ones. You have your magnetic platter style, which you have here. So basically there's this read head that kind of runs along this platter and magnetically reads and writes to it. Then you have solid state, which is a non-mechanical storage. Typically, it's going to end up being a lot smaller. So for instance, like NVMe, you don't need to know what that acronym means. It's just kind of a small little, almost flash drive sized storage, and you can get in like terabyte, 2 terabyte, and it's like credit card thin and about that long. SSDs are faster, so they can put a lot more data through. So if you're moving stuff from one location to another, or you're running a game, games will load faster just because you have faster read and write speeds. Hard drives are slower. They take longer. You have to spin a platter up. You have a read head that has to read the data, and then it has to move the data off of it. The trade-off that you have is SSDs are typically more expensive than HDDs. If you don't care about the speed, you can go with an HDD. It's totally fine. But if you want to load stuff faster, an SSD is where you want to be, but you're going to spend a little bit more to do it.
Okay, so are any of them less likely to crash on you than the other?
Absolutely. Okay, so anytime you're introducing a mechanical element in, you have a higher likelihood of having issues. The read head could go bad. The platter could go bad and shatter. It happens. You could drop this and the platter just shatters and you're done. Those are kind of the downsides to your mechanical media. So it could not even be something you do. It's just you have a surge here and your read head goes bad. That could be a problem and it could take it out. SSDs are less prone to those things because they don't have any mechanical parts. It's just chips on a board and that's it. You write to them with electricity and you read from them with electricity. So if you want a longer lasting technology, SSDs are your best bet. Less prone to crashing. Good question. Does your computer have to look like a rainbow puked on it? No, but it can. And that's the image that we have here. This would be like somebody's gaming setup, and they have, as you can see, they have a million bright lights on them. It's not necessary. It doesn't make it run faster. It doesn't have to look like that. Totally fine. They just like to spruce it up. Other considerations you have, you need to really think about how you're using your computer. Are you going to be mobile? If that's the majority of how you're going to be using it, like from the couch, at a coffee shop, you're going to probably want to look at a laptop. If you have a fixed place like a home office where you're going to be doing a lot of work and you're not going out all that much and you need something a little bit more powerful, a desktop is probably your best bet. When it comes to dollars per performance or for performance, a desktop is going to be a lot more powerful than a laptop equivalent. So consider that. Consider the usage you're going to have. So Jessica brought up, if you're checking your email and you're doing Word docs and, you're not doing, high-end gaming, like you're not trying to drive your computer into the ground, you're fine with a lower end computer. And it doesn't make sense for you to spend a ton of money on it. So if you feel that that's all you're going to use it for, and you're not going to dip your toe into higher end stuff, that i3 might be fine for you. Don't spend thousands of dollars on a computer.
Is that changing with laptops though? You said they're less powerful than desktops, which makes sense. But I mean, is that changing always, like in a couple of years? Are they going to be as powerful as current desktops?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the future, your laptop may be as good as my desktop, but it's not right now. So that's basically, the size is a limitation to how good it can be. If you made a laptop that was as good as my desktop right now, it would be very large. It would use a lot of battery. You'd almost have to have it plugged in all the time, just because when you get more power onto it, you're talking about more power draw. So there are some very diminishing returns to, getting that capability. Monitors, which we talked about. If you buy a desktop, you need a monitor. There's just no way about it. Laptops, got them built in, not a problem, don't have to worry about it. But you still want to pay attention to those things I talked about before, such as resolution, frame rate, that sort of stuff. Building your own versus pre-built. Not everybody is going to build their own computer. It's totally fine. But you can save a lot of money by doing it yourself. And after you've done it the first time, you can do it anytime after that. Or what you can do is you can talk to your friendly local neighborhood nerd, and they might do it for a 6-pack of beer, which I've done for quite a few times. Could save you a little bit of money.
Don't be advertising the entire.
Go ahead. What?
Don't be advertising this to the entire city. Oh my goodness.
Oh, so you can also buy a pre-built. There's no shame in doing that too. So if you go out, you want to buy a desktop, buy a powerful one, and don't want to mess around with having to pick out parts or build it yourself. There are plenty of options to do that, whether that's through like Dell or HP or whatever. There are options there. And then kind of the soul defining thing, it's a very kind of binary choice on this operating system. If you want a Windows operating system, you can buy pretty much any computer you want, and it's going to support a Windows system. Windows is ubiquitous, throughout the hardware world. Mac, you're kind of limited to, you have to buy Apple products. Apple products come with a premium price tag typically, and sometimes they are not nearly as powerful as their PC counterparts. The thing about that is they've kind of tweaked and gotten the operating system so it works really well on their hardware, but yeah, you are going to pay a little bit more to use it. So if you are already in the ecosystem of the iPhone or something, maybe getting a Mac is going to be a good choice for you because you're going to be familiar with it. You're already going to have an Apple ID. Just keep in mind that Macs are not known for gaming. So if you're going to do any of that, it's probably not going to be your best bet. And then there's Linux, which is typically your power users, your tech nerds that might dip their toe in Linux, but you're almost never going to find a consumer level computer that has Linux built in as the default operating system. But just to be aware that is out there.
I think that's where I felt most confused the last time I was trying to buy a computer, though, was trying to decide between Mac and Windows, because I just couldn't figure out why I would buy the Mac other than it just looked nicer. And I think at the time you said it had a solid state drive, and that was like, okay, that sounds nice because it won't crash, but it's so much more, and I couldn't justify buying it. So why do people end up buying it?
So people tend to buy Macs either if they have used them before and they have experience with them, so they're already customers, or you might want to push somebody towards a Mac if they're not at a higher technical level, like they just want it to work. Because as much as I love Windows, sometimes it takes a little more work and it's not nearly as intuitive as something like a Mac, where you have everything on your dock or your little bar at the bottom, and you click it and you're good to go. So if you have somebody that's maybe not as technically capable, a Mac might be a good option, but you do pay for the experience of that. So that's, and you can only buy that hardware from Apple. There are ways you can make your Mac OS work on non-Apple hardware, but that's not supported by them and it can be wonky. Don't do that. The experience that you're buying is you're buying Mac OS, you're buying the Apple products, and you're in the Apple ecosystem. And there's a premium with that.
Okay. All right. Do you have any more slides, Devin?
I do. And so kind of on the topic of cell phones, I know we're kind of coming up against it here. I want to leave some time for questions. The big things that you're going to kind of want to look at for cell phones are kind of the same things you would look at for computers and your TVs and monitors: resolution, refresh rate, processor, megapixels, or the resolution of your camera, the network that you're on, and then SIM card. We'll talk a little bit. Then we'll talk a little bit of locked versus unlocked, and then your OS or ecosystem that you're in, and then your contract versus kind of your pay-as-you-go options. Like with your monitors and TVs, typically a higher resolution is better. So you think a higher resolution on a same screen, if I have, the resolutions are much different than with a TV, but higher is typically better. The higher resolution you have, the cleaner it'll look, the better icons will look, video will look, that sort of thing. Your refresh rates, you're starting to see more and more that phone manufacturers are putting 90 hertz displays, 120 hertz displays. And what that means for you as a consumer is when you're swiping on your display, or you're playing a game, or you're browsing the internet or something, it's going to look a lot cleaner and it's going to scroll a lot better. So the experience it just feels faster, even when maybe there's not a big difference between models except for refresh rate. It'll just feel faster. Processor wise, a lot of brands use the same manufacturer, which is Qualcomm. So you might see that name a lot when they're talking about processors. So a lot of phone manufacturers use Qualcomm chips, and thus there's not that much separating them in terms of power. Depending on the chipset they're using. So you might have, a flagship phone like a Samsung using the same chipset as a non-market leader like a OnePlus or something like that. So don't let brands always blind you on that one. Cameras, nobody carries, photographers will carry dedicated cameras now, but everyone has a camera in their pocket now. And higher resolution is better. The more megapixels you have on it is better. But you're still kind of limited to this very flat camera here with multiple lenses. And what that means is the quality that you get is dependent on the lens that they're using, and then the software processing that they're using in the background. So if you're buying a cheaper phone, that's usually not a advantage for them to put a really nice camera into it. So generally, higher up you go in price, the better the camera you're going to get, because they place more emphasis on it. HDR I talked about before. So your phone will take maybe a series of images and composite them together to make like an image with better colors or better vibrancy or contrast. So some phones have that built in, usually the higher end phones. So flagships from well-known brands are likelier to have better cameras, for instance, the Google Pixel, Samsung Galaxy, and the iPhone. don't expect your camera quality to be as good as a dedicated camera. It's not going to be. You're limited entirely by the lens and the resolution that the camera is able to take. So if you have like a DSLR camera, it's going to do infinitely better than your iPhone is. But if you need to take quick shots and you're on vacation and you don't want to carry a dedicated one, and it's important to you to get good photos, maybe placing emphasis on a better camera is going to be better for you. Networks. So this ends up being tied to carriers. So there's two main 4G networks. 5G kind of blends them together, but there's GSM and CDMA. AT&T and T-Mobile operate on the GSM network. Verizon and Sprint are CDMA. So those networks are incompatible. So if I got a phone for AT&T and their 4G network, I couldn't bring it over to Verizon unless it supported that CDMA network as well. So a lot of people will buy a phone and they're like, oh, well, if I don't like this provider, I'll just go to this other one. Like AT&T doesn't have good service here, so I'm going to go to Sprint. And then you'll find out that your phone just doesn't work with the network, so you have to get a new phone. So there's two main things on 4G, and that's GSM and CDMA, which is something to consider. So if you're going with a provider, you want a phone that's going to match their network. Typically, if you buy a phone from that vendor, like if I walk into the Verizon store, they're going to be selling me a phone that is good for their network. So if you want to take the guesswork out of it, that's usually your best option. If you're going to buy a phone separate from the vendor, like, or maybe you're getting a hand-me-down phone from somebody else, you have to make sure that you're putting it on the right network, because if it's incompatible, it's just not going to work. A lot of times the vendors will have something where you can type in like a unique identifier for the phone into their website to tell if it's compatible with their network. So that's a way to verify that. Other considerations for your phone, ecosystems or OSs. Two big ones are iOS, which would be your iPhones, and Android, which would be your Google Pixels, your Samsung Galaxies, your LGs. If you are already in the iPhone ecosystem, so you've used an iPhone for years, you're probably going to be a little wary on going to an Android. There's nothing wrong with Android. It just comes down to comfortability. So that might be the first thing you want to consider. If you're not scared of a new experience, switching over to Android or switching over to iOS shouldn't be a huge impact, because for the most part, they kind of act the same. Locked and unlocked. So when you buy a phone from a vendor, a lot of times what they'll sell you is a locked phone. So it is locked to their network, and especially if it's under a contract. So your phone will be locked onto their system, and you can't port it over to another network unless you get it unlocked. So they might send a code that'll unlock for it, or you can actually buy unlocked phones right off the bat that are not, beholden to a contract, and then bring it onto a network. That's an option too. So that comes down to that contract and pay as you go. Contract, you're locked into, say, 2 years, but you get a free phone out of it. Might be worth it to you to just do that, to just, 2 years to get a new phone, and you sign a contract and you're good. You're fine with that vendor. But some people don't like being trapped into those contracts or having to get the phone that the vendor is giving you, and that's where pay as you go is. So for instance, I bought my Google Pixel outright, and I have it on Verizon, but I have a pay as you go. So monthly I get charged, and it actually ends up being cheaper than if I had a contract with them. Now, granted, I had to buy the phone outright, so there's that initial cost to it. But over the life of the phone, I'm actually saving money by not being on a contract. So if that's important to you, that is an option. Other things you want to know with your cell phone will be internal storage. So you might see 64 gigabytes of storage or space. You might see 128. Higher the better. Same with your computer. You might want to consider if it's expandable. It's like, so can I put a micro SD card in there and have more, or am I limited just to that 64 gigs? If you have a lot of music files, video files, take a lot of pictures, it might be important to you to have that option. Bloatware, awful. If you go in and buy from a vendor, there's the possibility that they're going to preload a bunch of their stuff onto it, like My Verizon or a bunch of apps that you don't want. That's going to be a higher likelihood if you're buying from a vendor. So something just to keep in mind. And then price. If you don't want to pay the upfront price of a phone, contract we talked about is totally good. And what they do is they subsidize you getting that phone just by you signing a contract. Pricing wise, phones go anywhere from a couple $100 up to, you know, $1,200, $1,300 for your flagships. So you have a lot of choices within that range. And, you know, you're typically giving up, you know, camera quality or speed of processor or something the lower you go down the range. Recommended models and brands, at least for me, if you're iOS, iPhone 12, get the newest that you can. iPhone, you know, you can go back if you want to, but iPhone 12 is kind of the newest. If you like Android and already use Android or want to try Android, Samsung Galaxy S20, the Google Pixel 4 or 5, or the OnePlus 8. OnePlus is a manufacturer that makes really nice phones that tend to have the same capabilities as the flagship or the more expensive, but less expensive. Google Pixels are also very competitively priced too. So you don't have to get my phone just started talking to me. You don't have to get the most expensive phone. Like a computer, depends on how you're using it.
Okay, Devin, let's pause. And we are at our hour, and I apologize if Zoom cuts us off. I'm not sure if it will or not. So if it does, apologies in advance. But Logan has a question. I might have missed it, so I apologize if you answered this. But what phone has the least amount of bloatware? Pixel ?
I would, in most cases, any unlocked phone you get, so any phone that is not sold to you by a vendor, is going to have a lot less likelihood of having bloatware on it.
That was my question though. When you say not sold to you by a vendor, what is, I don't know that everyone comprehends, what's your other option?
Good question. So when I say vendor, I mean you're walking into the Verizon store or you're walking into T-Mobile or Cricket or something like that. So any of the big carriers that you would have your cell service with, that's what I mean when I say vendor. My Pixel I bought directly from Google and I use it on Verizon and it has no bloatware on it. I mean, it has the standard apps, but as far as like installing stuff I really don't need, there's not a lot on there. Anything is really kind of at my discretion. In my opinion, if you want to make sure that you don't have a lot of stuff on it, Pixel is a pretty good bet. And they're priced very nicely too.
Okay, perfect. All right, last call for questions. If you have even something that's super hyper specific to what you're considering buying, feel free to ask. While apparently Zoom is going to let us go a minute over here. So last call. While you're thinking about that, I just wanted to mention this is recorded and we'll post it on, I believe, the City of Marion's website and possibly the Facebook page as well. It will be available after if you want to refer back to any of the information from today. And I just wanted to mention my email in case anyone thinks of a follow-up question. I can get it down to the person in the basement. I think I have pretty good access to that. So it's J Carney, Carney at cityofmarion.org. And you're also welcome to email me if you have future topics that you think would be good for Geek Out About. I'm always interested in that too. So like I said, we have 3 scheduled so far, but we could keep going if people continue to be interested. So feel free to contact me about that. I don't see any other questions, so I think we'll wrap it up. So thank you to Devin for putting together these slides and geeking out with us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I know that was a lot of material to pack into an hour, but like Jess said, shoot her an email. If you have a follow-up, I'll be happy to answer those.
Okay, bye everybody.